A torchlit chamber beneath the marble palaces of Rome, shadows stretching like claws across the walls, silence broken only by the faint drip of water from ancient pipes. In the stillness, an emperor sits alone, cloaked not in the regalia of state, but in the suffocating weight of his own appetites. The Roman world was built upon power, legions, wealth, conquest, but within the hidden chambers of its emperors, that power often turned inward, bending into shapes so monstrous that even Rome's hardened chroniclers hesitated to write them down. Tonight, we descend into that darkness. These are not the theatrical cruelties of Nero you've heard 100 times before, or the eccentricities of Caligula turned into entertainment by Hollywood. No, this is far worse. These are the stories Rome itself tried to bury, the whispered accounts of men who held absolute power and turned it into something far more terrifying than armies or laws. They turned it into a weapon against their own families, their lovers, their people. And what you're about to hear is not myth, not exaggeration, but testimony carved into history's most reluctant margins. Let us begin not with the fire of Rome or the roar of the Colosseum, but with water. The year is 130 AD, and the Nile is calm beneath the Egyptian moon. Emperor Hadrian, perhaps Rome's most celebrated builder and patron of the arts, kneels at the river's edge. His hand presses down against the head of a boy, Antinous, the emperor's beloved companion. The boy struggles, bubbles rising in frantic bursts. Then silence. Hadrian does not let go. He whispers words he has been taught by priests who promise him immortality through this act. Words that claim this is not murder, but transformation. The boy's soul, they say, will rise divine, and Hadrian will steal his youth, his beauty, his life. When at last he releases the body, it drifts with the current, while Hadrian convinces himself that power has passed into his veins. Within hours, Antinous is declared a god. Within months, temples rise in his name. An empire worships a drowned boy whose only sin was to be loved by a man who believed his desire was greater than death. It would be tempting to dismiss this as a single act of madness, a rare darkness in an otherwise brilliant reign. But Rome's emperors existed in a reality where boundaries dissolved. To be emperor was to have no equal, no restraint, no hand to stop you when appetite overran morality. And in that space, absolute authority, combined with unchecked desire, horror was born. Take Caracalla, son of Septimius Severus, heir to a divided throne. He shared rule with his brother Geta, and their father believed shared power would keep peace. Instead, he planted the seed of one of Rome's most chilling betrayals. The palace itself became a battlefield of whispers and silences. Walls were divided, servants split, even their mother, Julia Domna, forced to shuttle between them like a hostage. When Caracalla struck, it was in the only neutral ground left, their mother's chamber. Geta died in her arms, his blood staining her dress, while Caracalla proclaimed himself sole emperor. But the murder was only the beginning. Caracalla would not allow Geta's memory to survive. His name was erased from inscriptions, his image scraped from mosaics, his toys destroyed, his friends slaughtered. Even the servants who had once cradled him as a child were executed, as if memory itself were a crime. And Julia Domna, the mother forced to watch one son kill another, was forbidden to mourn. She was compelled to smile, to praise, to live as though the boy who died at her feet had never existed. But beneath this cruelty lay something darker. Ancient sources whisper of Caracalla's demands of his mother, demands that blurred the lines between maternal duty and something far more sinister. Julia's appearance changed, her clothing dictated, her presence transformed into that of an empress rather than a mother. Some say Caracalla justified his actions with myths of gods who lay with their mothers to create new worlds, claiming sacred precedent for desires too disturbing for even hardened Romans to speak openly. Whether exaggeration or truth, the image is clear. A woman trapped in a prison of her son's making, forced to live a role that defied the very order of family and state. She endured it for 6 years, until Caracalla's assassination freed her. And when she heard he was dead, the witnesses say she laughed for the first time in years. But her laughter was not victory, it was exhaustion, the final breath of a soul broken beyond repair. If Caracalla revealed how empire could corrupt family, Valentinian I showed how it could consume the self. He was a soldier's emperor, hard, disciplined, feared by enemies. But within his own halls, his fury became legend. Chroniclers describe him entering rages so violent that courtiers trembled, never sure if they were witnessing justice or madness. Interrogations became spectacles of humiliation, where families were forced to endure degradation in the name of state security. Wives stripped bare before senators, daughters subjected to examinations that blurred the line between trial and torment. The message was clear. To oppose Valentinian was to offer up your loved ones as sacrifices to his fury, and that fury grew until it quite literally destroyed him. In 375 AD, during negotiations with envoys from the Quadi, Valentinian's anger boiled over. His face purpled, his words dissolved into guttural sounds, and then silence, followed by collapse. Blood poured from his nose, his ears, perhaps even his eyes, as his body convulsed. He was dead within minutes, his brain ruptured by his own rage. Rome's physicians later described it as a stroke. Historians whispered of divine punishment. But to those who had lived under his reign, it seemed fitting that a man who had weaponized fury should be undone by it, consumed from within by the very violence he inflicted upon others. Even more chilling was what followed. His son Gratian quietly released the women kept in Valentinian's private quarters, captives of his peculiar justice. Many could not return to ordinary life. Their silence was their only testimony. Rome moved on, but the echoes of what they endured lingered in the shadows of history. And then there was Constans, son of Constantine the Great. Unlike his father, who reshaped Rome through conquest and Christianity, Constance's reign was consumed by his obsessions. He scoured the empire's frontiers for young captives, selecting them not for loyalty or skill, but for appearance. These boys were brought into his court, trained in rituals that mixed pagan mystery with imperial ceremony, transformed into living ornaments for his feasts and processions. Diplomats noted how treaties bent around his whims, how whole provinces were traded away for the possession of a single favored youth. The Senate grew uneasy, soldiers grew restless, and eventually they could no longer stomach his rule. Constance died alone, betrayed, abandoned by men who could no longer bear to be instruments of his desires. His downfall was not the work of barbarians or conspirators, but the collapse of respect, the quiet revolt of those who refused to enable him any longer. What unites these emperors, Hadrian, Caracalla, Valentinian, Constans, is not merely cruelty or excess, but the transformation of empire into theater for private appetites. The laws of Rome, the armies of Rome, the faith of Rome, all bent beneath the weight of what one man desired. And what makes these stories so haunting is not only the acts themselves, but the silence that followed. Chroniclers wrote cautiously, priests took vows of secrecy, families endured quietly, because in Rome, to speak against the emperor was to sign your own death warrant. And so, we inherit fragments, a line in Cassius Dio, a whisper in Herodian, a papyrus found in Egyptian sand, broken pieces of testimony that, when assembled, reveal a truth more unsettling than the flamboyant tales of Caligula or Nero. The truth that absolute power does not always erupt in spectacle. Sometimes it festers in private rooms behind closed doors, where appetites are indulged not for glory, but for control, not for show, but for the quiet satisfaction of proving that nothing, not even family, not even love, not even the gods, was beyond the emperor's reach. Before we continue deeper into this descent, I want to pause for just a moment. If you've stayed with me this far, you understand the weight of these stories, the sense that history hides its darkest truths beneath layers of silence. This channel exists to bring those shadows into the light, to give voice to what was meant to be forgotten. So, if you want to keep exploring these hidden histories with me, I'd ask you to subscribe, not as a favor, but as part of this strange journey we're on together, across centuries, across empires, through stories that still unsettle, because they remind us what power unchecked can truly become. And now, let us return, for the horrors we've uncovered so far are only the beginning. In the centuries after Hadrian, Caracalla, and Valentinian, darker figures emerged, emperors who mixed sorcery with sovereignty, who bent reality itself to feed their desires. Men like Maximinus Thrax, the towering soldier whose very body became a weapon against those closest to him, and emperors who blurred the lines between ritual and atrocity until the empire itself seemed cursed by their appetites. These are the stories that even Rome's most cynical historians hesitated to write down in full, and it is there, in the shadows of forgotten reigns, that we now turn. Because if what you've heard so far has disturbed you, what comes next will leave you questioning how much of Rome's grandeur was built not on marble and law, but on the silence of those who dared not speak. We left our journey in the shadow of emperors, whose names still echo faintly through history: Hadrian, Caracalla, Valentinian, Constans, men whose private appetites twisted family, faith, and power into tools of domination. Yet Rome's darkness did not end with them. The empire endured for centuries, and with each new emperor came new opportunities for human desire to bend reality itself. What you are about to hear is stranger, more disturbing, and in many ways, more haunting than anything before. These are the reigns where Rome itself seemed to recoil against the men who claimed to rule it, as if the very fabric of the empire rebelled against the weight of their hunger. Let us begin with a giant. Maximinus Thrax was not born into marble halls or silken robes. He came from the frontiers, from a family of Thracian peasants, towering above ordinary men. Ancient writers describe him as nearly 8 feet tall, his body a fortress of muscle, his hands so large he could wear his wife's bracelet as a ring. Soldiers adored his raw strength, and when civil war tore the empire apart in the 3rd century, they elevated him to emperor. But raw power rarely comes with refinement, and Maximinus ruled not with the discipline of a general, but with the insatiable appetite of a man who had only ever known hunger, food, wine, flesh. His needs were constant and overwhelming. Banquets became ordeals, with whole animals roasted just to satisfy him, rivers of wine drained in a single sitting. But it was not consumption alone that horrified his contemporaries. It was the way his size turned private encounters into acts of destruction. Ancient accounts, written in the guarded style of men who feared to say too much, suggest that those brought closest to him often did not survive the experience. The whispers describe women who emerged broken, unable to stand, others who did not emerge at all. To live in Maximinus's orbit was to gamble with survival, not because he sought cruelty, but because his very nature was excessive, overwhelming, inescapable. And like all appetites, his grew. Soldiers once loyal to him began to see his needs as bottomless pits that drained the empire's resources. Provinces were bled to fund his feasts, families stripped to fill his chambers. Eventually, even the men who had raised him turned. His own troops betrayed him, storming his camp while he slept. His death was swift, but the memory lingered. Rome had crowned a giant, and the giant had shown them what it meant when sheer appetite ruled without measure. If Maximinus embodied excess made flesh, the Emperor Valens revealed something far stranger, the collision of sorcery and sovereignty. Ruling in the late 4th century, Valens was a man caught between worlds, between Rome's fading gods and Christianity's rising tide, between the old rituals of empire and the new faith sweeping through its streets. And in that chaos, he turned to magicians. Stories tell of him gathering Syrian mystics and Egyptian priests, demanding rituals that could foretell rebellions, summon strength, even bend time itself. At Adrianople, where his reign ended in disaster, some claimed the air itself seemed to rebel, as though the empire was being punished for the emperor's dealings with forces beyond comprehension. His court whispered of underground chambers filled with smoke, of sacrifices performed in secret, of nights where stars seemed to shift at his command. Whether these tales were superstition or truth, one fact remains. Valens trusted sorcery more than strategy, ritual more than reason, and it led him into the jaws of annihilation. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378, his empire's fate turned to ash. Surrounded by Gothic warriors, his army collapsed, and Valens himself was lost in the chaos. Some say he died from an arrow, others that he burned alive, trapped in a farmhouse set aflame. But rumors spread of something stranger, that his body was never found because the rituals he had clung to had claimed him. Chroniclers describe soldiers searching for days, unable to find even bones. To Rome, his disappearance was not just defeat, it was horror. The idea that an emperor had bargained with forces so dark that even death refused to leave proof behind. But perhaps the most chilling stories of imperial power twisted into nightmare belong to Valentinian III. Unlike his namesake, who raged until his veins burst, Valentinian III wielded cruelty with cold calculation. He inherited a weakened empire, crumbling under barbarian invasions, but instead of focusing on defense, he transformed the imperial court into a theater of domination. His targets were not soldiers or rebels, but the highest families of Rome itself. Senators would be summoned to court only to watch as their wives were paraded before them, not in triumph, but as currency. To oppose the emperor was to risk seeing one's most intimate bonds turned into spectacle. Women of the nobility became bargaining chips, pawns in games meant to break the pride of Rome's ancient families. Historians, writing cautiously, describe him as a man who used marriage, fidelity, and honor as weapons, dissolving them in the acid of his desires. The empire's most sacred bonds became his stage, his tool, his pleasure. By the end of his reign, even his own court could bear it no longer. In 455 AD, Valentinian was assassinated in broad daylight on the field of Mars. Chroniclers describe the scene in almost religious tones, as if the city itself had conspired to rid itself of him. His body lay ignored for hours, a symbol of an emperor who had transformed the nobility into his playthings until they turned on him in silence and steel. And then there were emperors whose names are half forgotten, remembered only in fragments, rulers who blurred the line between devotion and destruction, between sacred ritual and unspeakable acts. They remind us that history often leaves its darkest pages unwritten, not because they did not happen, but because no one dared put them fully to paper. When we gather these fragments together, a pattern emerges. Again and again, Rome's emperors reveal the same truth, that unchecked power erodes the very concept of boundaries. One emperor drowns a beloved companion in the Nile, convinced it is transformation. Another forces his mother into roles no language can comfortably describe. Another consumes with rage until his body bursts. Another bends the state into a machinery of desire, trading away frontiers for beauty. Another feeds his body until those around him collapse beneath it. Another turns to sorcery until even his corpse disappears. Another transforms matrimony into currency until the nobility itself revolts. This is not the Rome of triumphal arches or marble forums. This is Rome as its own worst nightmare, an empire that believed itself eternal, yet was corroded from within by the appetites of men who wore its crown. And in that realization lies the true horror. Not that these emperors existed, but that their power allowed them to shape the lives, the loves, the very souls of millions, according to whims that most men would not admit even to themselves. History often reduces them to caricatures, madmen, tyrants, monsters. But the truth is more unsettling. They were human, human with desires, human with fears, human with hungers. And what their reigns prove is that when humanity is given absolute power, the line between man and monster vanishes. The emperors did not become gods, they became mirrors, reflecting the darkest possibilities of what we might all be if no law, no morality, no consequence stood in our way. So when we walk among the ruins of Rome, when we gaze upon its broken columns and crumbling arenas, we should remember that the stones do not only tell stories of gladiators and senators, of victories and loss, they whisper of chambers where silence concealed horrors, of temples razed to cover crimes, of statues that glorified men whose hands were drenched in the shadows of their own appetites. The empire fell, not with a single battle or a single sack, but with centuries of corrosion from within. And though Rome is gone, its emperors remain a warning. That absolute power does not elevate, it corrupts. That unchecked desire does not satisfy, it consumes. That when one man's will becomes law, history itself becomes a victim, leaving behind only fragments and whispers for us to piece together centuries later. Perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the emperors we have named, Hadrian, Caracalla, Valentinian, Constans, Maximinus, Valens, Valentinian III are only the ones history remembered. How many others, lost to fire, to silence, to fear, left no record at all? How many rituals? How many broken families? How many shadows remain unspoken? Perhaps more than we will ever know. And so, as we close this descent into Rome's darkest chambers, I leave you with a question. What is more terrifying, that these stories are true, or that they are only fragments of something even worse? A darkness so profound that history itself chose silence rather than memory. Tell me what you think. Which emperor's story struck you the hardest tonight? And do you believe that empires fall more often from their enemies outside or from the shadows their rulers create within? Because Rome may be dust, but the question it leaves behind still burns. When power knows no limits, what horrors are not only possible, but inevitable?